The day began with a deceptive calm. Anna drove in silence, but inside, her world felt like a hurricane. Her body was exhausted from the weight of her advanced pregnancy, her back aching more with each kilometer she drove, and though the doctor's appointment was close, the tension wouldn't let her rest. She had been dealing with pregnancy complications for weeks, and her doctor had warned her that any delay in appointments could mean a risk for her and her baby. She gently stroked her swollen belly as she tried to remember her husband's words of encouragement that morning. "Everything will be fine," he had told her before she left the house. The sky was covered with gray clouds, like a heavy blanket threatening to spill rain at any moment. The air on the road felt oddly dense, and traffic was starting to thin out as Anna drove further away from the city center. She had carefully planned this trip, knowing the streets would be less congested at this time. She was aware that the calm surrounding her was only temporary, a pause before what she knew would be a crucial hospital visit. As she cautiously maneuvered down a deserted avenue, she felt a familiar twinge in her lower back. The pain, which had been present for much of her pregnancy, was returning with force. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath as she tried to focus on the road. The hospital was only a few kilometers away, and she knew that if she could just get there in time, she could avoid major complications. But when she opened her eyes again, she saw something she hadn't expected. A flash of blue lights in her rearview mirror. It was a police patrol, and it was following her closely, with its lights flashing and the siren softly whistling. Anna's heart raced immediately. She didn't understand why they were pulling her over. She hadn't broken any laws, she wasn't speeding, and she hadn't run a red light. Why was the police following her? She looked in the rearview mirror, hoping the car would pass her, but the patrol continued to follow her, persistent. The blue lights flashed intermittently, signaling her to pull over to the side of the road. Anna took a deep breath, her fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. Her first reaction was confusion, but soon that feeling transformed into growing anxiety. She knew that, as a black woman, every interaction with the police could escalate into something bigger, something more dangerous. Even though she didn't want to think the worst, her mind was inevitably filled with memories of stories she had heard so many times. Stories of innocent people, people like her, who had been stopped for no reason and whose lives had changed forever in a matter of minutes. She decided to comply and gently turned the wheel to the right, parking the car in a safe spot on the side of the road. The siren turned off, but the lights continued flashing behind her, reflecting in the mirrors and filling the interior of the car with blue and red flashes. Anna turned off the engine, her hands trembling as she pulled out the documents she knew the officer would ask for. She looked out the window, noticing that the patrol car had stopped right behind her, blocking any exit. She could hear the sound of the patrol door opening and closing, followed by the heavy footsteps of the officer slowly approaching. The silence on the road became more oppressive. Each step the officer took toward her seemed to echo with a disturbing weight. Anna tried to calm herself, repeating over and over again that she had nothing to worry about. It was just a routine stop. She hadn't done anything wrong. Her mind tried to cling to that idea, but part of her knew that in situations like this, being innocent wasn't always enough. There was something in the air, a tension she couldn't ignore. The officer finally reached her window. He was a tall, burly man, fair-skinned with a cold expression that showed no sign of courtesy. He wore sunglasses that reflected her own image back at her, making her feel small and vulnerable. The officer's dark blue uniform was immaculate, and the name embroidered on his chest read Smith. Anna felt a chill as she saw him up close. Everything about his presence seemed calculated to impose authority, to make it clear that he was in control. Smith didn't give her time to mentally prepare. Without saying a word, he made a brusque gesture with his hand, signaling her to roll the window down completely. Anna complied, trying to remain calm. As she did so, a dark thought crossed her mind. Was there something wrong with the car that she hadn't noticed? Had she missed a traffic signal? Her anxiety grew with every second of silence. When Smith finally spoke, his voice was harsh and lacked any trace of kindness. Without any preamble, he demanded her documents. Anna, her hands still trembling, handed them over as she tried to explain that she was on her way to the hospital. She felt her voice crack a little as she mentioned her pregnancy, as if her body, already worn out by weeks of tension, was finally giving in to the weight of the situation. She didn't expect the officer to be kind, but she also didn't expect what happened next. Smith took the documents, but he didn't even look at them closely. His gaze remained fixed on her, cold and unrelenting. Anna could feel the hardness in those eyes, watching her as if she had already been judged. Every second that passed under that gaze made her feel more vulnerable. She wanted to explain, to tell him she hadn't done anything wrong, that she was just trying to get to her medical appointment, but the words caught in her throat. Why did she feel so much fear? Why did something as simple as a traffic stop feel so threatening? The officer broke the silence with a question she didn't expect. Instead of asking her about her destination, he interrogated her about what she had in the car. There was an implicit suspicion in his tone, an unspoken accusation. Anna, surprised, could only respond that she wasn't carrying anything strange, just documents and personal items. But Smith didn't seem satisfied with that answer. His face remained impassive, as if he were waiting for her to make a mistake, to say something incriminating. The silence between them grew even heavier, as if the unsaid words carried more weight than those that were spoken. Anna felt a knot in her stomach. She knew she had to stay calm, to be careful with every word she said, with every move she made. Her mother had always warned her never to show defiance to a police officer, especially as a black woman. It doesn't matter if you're right, she used to say, always keep your head down and cooperate. But despite all those warnings, Anna couldn't help but feel the injustice of the situation. Why did she have to justify her existence to a man who already seemed to have decided that she was guilty of something? The officer made no additional comments. He didn't return the documents or show any sign that the situation would end soon. Instead, suddenly, he ordered her to step out of the car. Anna froze for a moment. She didn't understand why she had to get out. He hadn't given any valid reason for taking her out of the vehicle, and much less for doing so abruptly. Her heart began to pound harder, and she could feel the cold sweat covering her forehead. She tried to reason with the officer, to explain that she was pregnant, that getting out of the car in her condition was difficult, but Smith wasn't listening. His patience, if he ever had any, seemed to have run out. Before she could react, the officer abruptly opened the car door and grabbed her arm with force. Anna screamed as pain shot through her body, and in that moment, terror completely consumed her. She knew something terrible was about to happen, something she wouldn't be able to stop. The rough pavement under Anna's knees brought her back to reality in a brutal way. The pain she felt from being pushed out of the car was immediate and sharp, radiating from her knees up to her lower abdomen, where the weight of her pregnancy became even more unbearable in that position. Anna fell to her knees, trying to protect her belly with trembling hands. With each passing second, her fear intensified, her thoughts blurred by pain and confusion. She could feel her heartbeat blending with her baby's nervous movements inside her belly, a sensation that had once filled her with joy but now only brought terror. She knew she was in danger, and even worse, her baby was too. Smith showed no compassion. With a frown and a sneer of disdain, he roughly pulled her up by the arm, causing Anna to scream involuntarily from the pain shooting through her body. She clumsily tried to stand, but her legs shook, and her balance was fragile due to the pregnancy. The officer didn't seem to notice, or perhaps didn't care, that she was clearly unable to move easily. He pushed her hard against the hood of her own car, his cold, stern hands digging into her wrists as he kept her pinned against the hot metal of the vehicle. Anna, struggling to breathe, tried to plead. She felt the panic rising in her chest like a high tide, flooding her thoughts. She wanted to tell him to stop, that there was no need to use so much force, that she was just a pregnant woman on her way to the hospital. But the words wouldn't come out clearly. Her throat was dry, as if fear had stripped her of the ability to speak. She tried to take deep breaths, but each one was interrupted by the pressure she felt on her stomach and the pain in her back. Every time she tried to move, Smith pressed her harder against the hood, making her body tremble with pain. As she lay there, her face pressed against the cold metal of the car, reality seemed to distort around her. The sounds of the street became diffuse, distant, as if everything around her had lost its clarity. But then something broke through that fog, the sound of voices. At first, barely audible, but then growing louder, more insistent. Anna opened her eyes and through her tears, saw how a few people were starting to stop nearby, clearly distressed by what they were witnessing. A middle-aged woman with a look of disbelief on her face stood on the sidewalk, clearly upset by what she saw. Behind her, a young man was approaching with his phone in hand, recording what was happening. Anna could hear fragments of what the bystanders were saying. Words like injustice and brutality floated in the air, mixing with the distant noise of passing cars. The voices grew louder, not just murmurs, but shouts of indignation. People began gathering, forming a small circle around the patrol car and Anna's vehicle, as if they were witnessing a scene straight out of the news. The attention of the passers-by was palpable, and though the crowd was small, the tension in the air grew with each passing second. Despite the growing number of onlookers, Smith seemed unfazed. He continued to hold Anna down with force, ignoring her cries of pain and the desperate pleas she threw at him between sobs. The humiliation piled onto the fear. She could feel the eyes of everyone watching the scene, but despite that, she could do nothing to free herself. It wasn't just the physical pain, it was the horror of knowing she was powerless against someone who had absolute authority in that moment. Everything she had learned about how to behave in such situations seemed useless. Her mother had taught her to stay calm, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of being treated like a criminal for no reason. The voices of the crowd grew louder, with some people starting to yell at the officer, telling him to stop, that it wasn't necessary to use so much force, especially since she was clearly pregnant. Some even openly insulted him, but Smith paid no attention. He remained absorbed in his control of the situation, his authority unshakable, as if the crowd's shouts were nothing more than the annoying buzz of insects around him. But things began to change quickly as the situation attracted more attention. The number of people around Anna's car grew, and along with it, so did the outrage. Some of the bystanders began filming with their phones, documenting every moment of the abuse Anna was enduring. They knew that this kind of situation needed to be shown to the world, that the face of police brutality had to be exposed so there could be a chance for justice. The anger on the faces of the bystanders contrasted with the desperation in Anna's eyes, who could barely stand as Smith mercilessly pressed her against the hood. In a moment of extreme distress, Anna felt a jolt in her abdomen, a sharp pain that made her let out a louder, more desperate scream. It was her baby. The pain wasn't just from the pressure the officer was putting on her, but from something deeper, something that was wrong inside her body. Her instinct told her something wasn't right, that the stress and violence were affecting her child. But before she could process what was happening, her body began to fail. Her legs gave way, and if it hadn't been for Smith holding her, she would have fallen to the ground again. The crowd began to stir. The sight of a pregnant woman being mistreated in such a way, her face contorted with pain, was enough to push some of the onlookers closer, challenging the officer's authority. The tension in the air reached its peak when a young man, still holding his phone, dared to shout directly at Smith, demanding that he let her go before something terrible happened. Anna could hear the voices, but everything around her seemed to lose its sharpness. The pressure in her chest became unbearable, and an overwhelming dizziness began to take hold of her mind. She wanted to scream, to tell everyone to help her, that her baby was in danger, but she couldn't find the words. The crowd shouted for her, their voices blending into a chaotic chorus of indignation and fear. And amid all that noise, Anna felt as if the world was beginning to fade away, as if the pain was dragging her to a place from which she might not return. It was at that precise moment that a second officer arrived at the scene. The patrol car screeched to a halt right behind Smith's vehicle, and out of it stepped a younger man, his face clearly troubled by the scene unfolding before him. His name was Garcia, and although his uniform was the same as Smith's, his expression told a very different story. Garcia, for his part, kept speaking with Smith, insisting that he stop completely and cease using force. He knew that what was happening was unacceptable, and the consequences could be devastating if he didn't act immediately. He was trying to appeal to the remaining sense of reason in his colleague, though he knew that Smith was more focused on maintaining control than recognizing the danger he had put Anna in. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Smith reluctantly let go of Anna. His hands, which had been firmly gripping her, relaxed, but his face showed clear disdain. Despite Garcia's insistence, it seemed like Smith couldn't conceive that he had done anything wrong. In his mind, he was in the right, and everything he had done was justified by his position of authority. The crowd, however, wasn't willing to let what they had witnessed slide. Although Anna was now out of Smith's physical grip, the people's shouts didn't stop. What had happened before their eyes was a display of police brutality that they couldn't ignore. Some began moving closer to the officers, demanding explanations and calling for Smith to be stopped. Others continued recording, ensuring the world would see what had happened there. As Garcia tried to de-escalate the situation and move Smith away from the scene, Anna felt her body give in completely. Her legs trembled uncontrollably, and a deep pain radiated through her abdomen. She wanted to scream, to ask for help, but all she could do was look around, desperately searching for someone to help her escape this nightmare. She knew she didn't have much time, that her baby was in danger, and that she needed to get to the hospital as soon as possible. But her body was no longer responding. It was then that Anna lost her balance and collapsed to the ground, her vision finally going completely dark. The crowd's shouts blended with the sound of passing cars and distant sirens. Everything became a blur of lights and shadows as Anna, unable to endure any more, slipped into unconsciousness. The echo of the shouts and sirens faded for Anna the moment her body hit the pavement. Everything went dark, as if the world around her had been covered by a thick fog. The pain, once sharp and constant, became a distant sensation as her mind plunged into a deep abyss from which she couldn't escape. Her last images were of the crowd surrounding her, worried faces, phones recording, voices raised in protest, and then, nothing. An absolute silence enveloped her as her consciousness slipped away. Chaos continued around her. Garcia, the young officer, was the first to react upon seeing Anna collapse. He ran to her, his face a mix of horror and urgency. He knew that every second counted. Kneeling beside Anna, he saw the pallor in her face, the cold sweat that drenched her forehead, and, most alarmingly, the barely perceptible movement of her belly. The officer felt a growing pressure in his chest, fully aware of the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a woman who had been mistreated, it was two lives, Anna's and her unborn child's. The crowd, which had been on the edge of anger, paused for a moment when they saw Anna lying on the ground, motionless. The phones kept recording, but the tension that had dominated the atmosphere was replaced by a collective fear. People started moving closer, some calling for help, others shouting for an ambulance. Though the anger still simmered, the focus had shifted entirely. Now, it was about saving a woman and her baby. The situation, which had been a direct confrontation with authority minutes earlier, had transformed into a race against time. Garcia grabbed his radio, his voice firm but rushed as he called for an ambulance. The urgency in his tone left no doubt about what was happening. They needed medical assistance immediately. As he spoke, he tried to keep Anna stable, touching her wrist to feel the weak but present pulse. He knew there wasn't much more he could do but wait, yet each passing second felt like an eternity. The crowd around him watched expectantly, some silent, others praying quietly, as if they understood that what was at stake went beyond the police brutality they had witnessed. At that moment, Smith, who had remained on the sidelines, began to feel the pressure. The crowd looked at him with a mix of contempt and fury, some hurling insults, others demanding answers. He, with his jaw clenched, tried to ignore them, but the weight of his actions was beginning to catch up with him. Despite his attempt to remain indifferent, the reality of the situation finally hit him. A pregnant woman was now unconscious, largely due to his excessive aggression. The crowd had seen it all, and the phones still recording were a threat he could no longer dismiss. He knew the situation was spiraling out of control, and the consequences could be devastating. While Smith kept his distance, Garcia tried to stay calm. The sound of the approaching ambulance sirens echoed in the distance, but they weren't coming fast enough for his liking. Anna showed no signs of improvement, her breathing was irregular, and her body seemed too weak to bear the weight of the damage she had suffered. The young officer looked at her belly with concern. Was her baby still okay? The uncertainty was unbearable. The ambulance finally arrived, screeching to a halt in the street, breaking the tense silence that had formed around the scene. Two paramedics quickly got out, carrying equipment as they pushed through the crowd. People stepped aside with murmurs of relief, but the atmosphere remained charged with a mix of fear and fury. Everyone knew something had irreversibly changed, and even though the paramedics were there, the sense that things had already gone too far persisted. The paramedics knelt beside Anna, quickly and professionally assessing her condition. As they worked, Garcia gave them a brief explanation of the situation, without hiding the gravity of it. A pregnant woman, subjected to a violent confrontation with the police, now unconscious and potentially at risk, along with her baby. The words echoed in everyone's minds, and as the paramedics worked to stabilize Anna, the crowd watched with growing anxiety. After what felt like endless minutes, the paramedics decided that Anna needed to be transported to the hospital immediately. They carefully but swiftly placed her on a stretcher, with the urgency the situation demanded. One of the paramedics looked at Garcia seriously before getting into the ambulance. "There's no time to lose," he said. "She's in critical condition, and we need to intervene as soon as possible." The ambulance sped away with Anna inside, its red lights flashing as it quickly disappeared from the scene. The crowd, which had remained restrained until that moment, finally began to react. Some continued recording, others cried or shouted in anger. No one could forget what had happened before their eyes. The words injustice and brutality passed from mouth to mouth as people tried to process what they had just witnessed. The following minutes were chaotic. The street was filled with a mixture of emotions: fear, rage, disbelief. The witnesses knew that what had occurred couldn't go unpunished. The news would spread quickly, the videos would soon hit social media, and the pressure for justice would only grow. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Anna was fighting for her life, and her babies. In the emergency room, the doctors received Anna with the same urgency as the paramedics. Her condition was critical. She had suffered severe trauma, and the extreme stress she had experienced had put both her life and her babies at risk. The doctors worked frantically, trying to stabilize her. Monitors began beeping as the doctors did everything possible to keep her alive. But Anna's condition wasn't improving, and time was her worst enemy. Anna's husband, Daniel, arrived at the hospital shortly after. When he got the call, he was in the middle of work, and at first, he couldn't believe what he was hearing. His wife in an ambulance. Police brutality. The words were like dull blows that didn't fully sink in. But when he finally arrived at the emergency room, reality hit him like an icy wave. Anna, his wife, his life partner, the woman carrying his child, was now lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to monitors, her life hanging by a thread. The doctors explained the seriousness of the situation. Anna was in critical condition, and her baby was also in danger. They needed to do everything they could to stabilize them both, but the next few hours would be decisive. Daniel, devastated by the news, stayed in the waiting room, unable to process what had happened. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. Outside, protests were starting to organize, and the community was demanding justice for what had happened to Anna. The hours in the hospital's waiting room passed with unbearable slowness. Daniel, his head in his hands and elbows on his knees, could barely keep calm. The murmurs of the medical staff and the constant hum of monitors in the emergency room kept him on the edge of despair. Every time a doctor passed by, he hoped to hear some news, some update on Anna and the baby, but the silence was devastating. Each minute felt like a slow blow, a cruel reminder of the uncertainty hanging over their lives. Clutching his phone, Daniel scrolled through social media over and over, searching for any information, any clue about what had really happened on the street that morning. The videos had already started to circulate. The first recording he saw was a direct blow to his soul, Anna's face, twisted in pain, as Officer Smith brutally shoved her against the car's hood. The sound of her voice begging for help, her hands desperately protecting her belly. Seeing that scene forced a strangled cry out of him, echoing through the silence of the waiting room. It felt unreal. He couldn't accept that this woman, his woman, was in that situation. The comments beneath the video showed a collective fury. Social media users were denouncing police brutality with anger. Some shared messages of support for Anna, while others called for action, demanding that Officer Smith be arrested immediately. The video was going viral, and though Daniel was grateful that the injustice was being seen by thousands of people, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. Anna and their babies' lives were hanging in the balance, and online reactions weren't going to change their situation. Meanwhile, outside the hospital, the community was beginning to organize. The incident hadn't gone unnoticed, especially not by those already fed up with witnessing repeated acts of violence and abuse by the authorities. A local group of activists, who closely followed news of police brutality, quickly mobilized. The first signs appeared in front of the hospital, bearing phrases like "Justice for Anna" and "No more police brutality." What had begun as a small gathering of people quickly grew into a protest, attracting media and civil rights advocates. The collective rage was palpable. People from all over the city joined the cause, driven not only by what had happened to Anna but also by the accumulated fatigue of hearing so many similar stories, so many lives shattered by a system that seemed unchangeable. The images of Anna being dragged out of her car, treated with unjustifiable violence, ignited the flame of indignation that had been burning in the hearts of that community for far too long. Inside the hospital, Daniel could barely process what was happening outside. News trickled into him in fragments, friends and family calling to tell him that the protests were growing, that people were demanding justice in his wife's name. Some told him that human rights organizations were already preparing complaints, that the wheels were in motion to launch a formal investigation against Officer Smith. Though it was a relief to know they weren't alone in this fight, deep down, all Daniel could think about was Anna, her fragile body fighting to survive, the baby he hadn't even had the chance to meet. Finally, the doctors came out to speak with Daniel. The seriousness of their expressions confirmed what he feared most: Anna's condition was critical. She had endured a significant amount of physical and emotional stress, which had further complicated her already difficult pregnancy. Though the baby was still showing signs of life, he was in danger due to the pressure and blows Anna had received. The doctors explained that the next few hours would be crucial. If they couldn't stabilize both Anna and the baby, the outcome could be tragic. Daniel felt the world collapse around him, as if the air had been ripped from his lungs. He staggered to a chair and sank into it heavily. The doctor's words echoed in his mind like an endless refrain: complications, risk, critical. He had reached the limit of what he could endure. His mind filled with images of Anna during happier times, of the moments when he first felt the baby kick, of the dreams they shared for their child. All of that now hung by a thread, and the helplessness was like an overwhelming weight that crushed him. Outside, the protests continued to grow. The news had reached major media outlets, and local and national TV networks began covering the case. Videos of Smith's brutality were broadcast on the evening news, and pressure on the police department grew exponentially. Within hours, the situation had become a national scandal. Journalists sought statements from community leaders, activists, and even the police department, which, under the media scrutiny, was forced to issue a statement. The police department's statement was brief and vague, saying that the incident was under internal investigation and that, for the moment, they would not make further comments. But that wasn't enough to quell the public's outrage. What they wanted was justice, and they wouldn't stop until they got it. Human rights lawyers immediately became involved. They had already begun gathering witness testimonies, videos, photos, any evidence that could help bring the case to justice. Local organizations that fought against police brutality offered their support to Anna's family, mobilizing resources to ensure that Smith wouldn't go unpunished. Social media exploded with hashtags calling for justice for Anna and her baby, and the pressure to arrest the officer grew with each passing hour. Inside the hospital, however, Daniel remained trapped in his own pain. Despite the news of the growing movement surrounding the case, the only thing that mattered to him in that moment was Anna's survival. Everything else, even the fight for justice, seemed insignificant compared to the possibility of losing her and their baby. Night slowly fell over the city, and though the protests continued, the intensity of the day began to yield to the darkness. Yet inside the hospital, time seemed to stand still. Daniel remained seated in the same chair, unable to move, his thoughts caught in an endless cycle of fear and hope. The doctor's words continued to echo in his mind, and every time a doctor passed by the room, his heart would stop, expecting, fearing the worst. Finally, in the early hours of the morning, a doctor entered the room with a serious expression. Daniel stood up immediately, his body tense with anticipation. The doctor looked at him steadily before speaking, carefully choosing his words. The doctor's words were like a gust of uncertainty sweeping over Daniel. He could barely process what he was being told, his mind was floating in a sea of conflicting emotions. The doctor, wearing an expression of both concern and professionalism, explained that Anna had been stabilized, but she remained in critical condition. The medical team's efforts had managed to halt what seemed like an inevitable decline, and although she remained unconscious, the baby was still fighting inside her. The initial relief of knowing they were both still alive was fleeting. The word "critical" continued to ring in Daniel's mind like a bell. He couldn't relax, not when there was still a chance he could lose his wife or their baby. But for the first time since it all began, he felt a glimmer of hope. They were fighting, both Anna and the baby, and if they weren't giving up, neither would he. After speaking with the doctor, Daniel walked to the room where Anna was being treated. When he arrived, his heart skipped a beat. The air in the room was cold, sterile, and the sound of monitors and machines was the only thing breaking the silence. Anna lay in the bed, pale, her eyes closed, connected to several devices monitoring her condition. Seeing her like that shattered him. The strength he had always seen in his wife was now hidden beneath a weakened body, her arms thin, her skin without color. But even in that state, Anna was still the woman he loved, the mother of his child, and he couldn't lose her. Daniel approached the bed, took her cold hand, and knelt beside her. He spoke softly, his words barely audible. He told her how much he loved her, how much they needed her to recover, that he couldn't lose her, not now, not when they were so close to meeting their child. Tears began to roll down his cheeks, but he ignored them. He felt that if he kept talking, if he maintained his connection with her, he could somehow keep her here with him, fighting against the darkness that surrounded outside. As Daniel kept vigil for Anna, the streets remained a hotbed of activity. News of Anna's critical condition only fueled the fervor of the community. The protests continued, and they were no longer just local. Civil rights activists from other cities began to arrive, joining the cause, condemning not only the brutality Anna had suffered but also the pattern of abuse that Black and Latino communities had endured for decades. The fight for justice for Anna had become a symbol of resistance, a demand for change that extended beyond her specific case. Under immense pressure from the media and the protests, the police were forced to act. Initially, the department had tried to handle the situation with vague statements, mentioning an ongoing investigation, but the pressure was too great. Faced with public and political scrutiny, they announced that Officer Smith would be placed on administrative leave while the case was investigated. But for the community, this wasn't enough. They wanted him arrested immediately. They wanted Smith to pay for what he had done. Social media exploded with the hashtag #JusticeForAnna, which became a unified call to action. Local politicians began to join the movement, demanding that the case be treated with the urgency it deserved. Every day that passed, more people joined the cause. National news outlets and journalists from across the country arrived at the hospital and police station to cover the events, interviewing activists, lawyers, and witnesses. Daniel, though aware of what was happening outside, remained focused on Anna. The situation in the streets mattered to him, but not as much as the situation inside that small hospital room. From time to time, a friend or family member would call to update him on what was going on, but he would respond briefly, unable to pay attention to anything other than the slow sound of the monitor tracking Anna's heartbeat. One of those days, Daniel's phone buzzed forcefully in his pocket. It was his sister, Sophia. At first, he had no intention of answering, but seeing her persistence, he picked up with a weary sigh. Sophia, on the other line, told him that the community had organized a vigil outside the hospital. People were praying, lighting candles, and uniting their voices in support for Anna. They had brought photos of her, banners with messages of love and hope, asking her to recover, to not give up. The vigil stretched several blocks, with hundreds of people gathered, singing softly, their faces illuminated by the candle flames. Some held signs that said, "Anna, we are with you," while others simply stood in silence, letting their presence speak for them. Daniel was speechless for a moment, feeling a mixture of gratitude and sorrow wash over him. He knew he wasn't alone in his pain, that Anna's fight had resonated in the hearts of many. That vigil, that massive show of support, was proof that Anna was more than just a victim in people's minds. She was a fighter, a woman whose bravery and humanity inspired everyone. With a trembling voice, he thanked Sophia for informing him and hung up, unable to contain his tears. Despite all the suffering, there was hope in knowing that so many people had come together to support them. That night, Daniel briefly left the hospital to witness the vigil. When he reached the entrance, he was awestruck by what he saw. The crowd, hundreds of people, holding lit candles, praying in solemn silence. Some raised their hands to the sky, others embraced each other in solidarity. It was a breathtaking sight. Daniel, physically and emotionally exhausted, felt a surge of emotion course through his body. He slowly approached the crowd, and though some recognized him and offered words of comfort, he remained silent, watching the flickering candlelight and allowing the community's energy to envelop him. In the center of the crowd, a little girl, no more than 8 years old, held a candle in one hand and a sign in the other that read, "Anna, you can do it." Daniel approached her, and when he looked into her eyes, he saw the purity of her hope, the innocence of her belief that everything could get better. That simple image moved him more than any words. It was a reminder of why they were still fighting. Not just for Anna, but for a future where children like that little girl could live without fear, in a world where justice prevailed. He returned to the hospital feeling that something had changed. Though he didn't know what the future held for Anna and their baby, that night he felt the power of his community's support, and for the first time in days, he believed that hope still had a place in their lives. Daniel re-entered the hospital with a lighter heart. The vigil, the candles, the faces of strangers who had gathered to support Anna and their family had reignited in him a spark of hope that he hadn't felt in days. He walked down the dimly lit hallways, sensing that something in the air had shifted. Although Anna remained in critical condition, the energy from the people outside gave him the strength to keep going. He knew they couldn't give up, not when so many people believed in them, not when the community had shown such unwavering faith. When he entered Anna's room again, he found her just as he had left her. Her body lay still in the bed, connected to the monitors that marked the slow, rhythmic beats of her heart. He approached slowly and, as he had done from the beginning, took her cold hand and sat beside her, whispering words of encouragement. It didn't matter if she could hear him or not. He told her she wasn't alone, that the world outside was fighting for her, that the worst was over, and that soon she could wake up. But that night, things began to take an unexpected turn. It was early morning when Daniel, exhausted from fatigue, finally fell asleep in the chair next to the bed. The hospital was quiet, and only the hum of machines and the distant murmur of nurses in the hallways broke the stillness. In the midst of that silence, Anna's monitor began to emit an irregular beeping. Daniel, groggy from sleep, woke to the alarming sound. His heart jumped in his chest as he saw the lines on the monitor becoming erratic. Within seconds, the room's doors flew open, and several doctors rushed in. The lights flicked on abruptly, filling the room with a blinding white glare. Daniel was pushed into a corner as the doctors worked frantically over Anna. He heard rapid words, medical terms he couldn't understand, but the urgency in their voices told him that something was terribly wrong. Anna began to convulse slightly, her once still body now shaken by small but alarming spasms. The doctors tried to stabilize her, moving with precision and speed, while the monitor continued to beep irregularly. One doctor called for an injection, another checked her oxygen levels. The chaos in the room was total, but to Daniel, everything felt as though it were happening in slow motion. Then, without warning, Anna stopped moving. The monitor emitted a long, continuous beep, the sound Daniel had always feared hearing. In that moment, his world came to a complete halt. All the noise around him seemed to fade in an instant, and the only thing that remained was the deafening silence of the flatline. One of the doctors attempted to resuscitate her, another called for more medication, but Daniel could no longer hear anything they were saying. He was paralyzed, watching as the woman he loved faded before his eyes. The following minutes were a blur of images and sounds, flashes of lights and hands moving over Anna's body. Each passing second was like a knife to his heart. The entire world was collapsing around him, and all he could do was stand there helplessly. Then, when all seemed lost, something happened that no one expected. One of the doctors, the most senior of the team, suddenly paused as he checked the baby's condition. He frowned, as if something didn't add up, and then looked at the team around him. With a strange calm amidst the chaos, he asked for the baby's vital signs to be checked again. There was a brief silence in the room as one of the doctors brought the equipment closer to verify. What they found left everyone astonished. The baby was still alive. The doctor, with a look of amazement, turned to Daniel and explained, in a trembling voice, that somehow the baby had survived all the trauma and was still fighting for life inside Anna's womb. They didn't understand how it was possible, given Anna's critical condition, but the little heart was still beating strongly. Daniel, unable to process what he was hearing, felt a wave of emotions so intense it nearly knocked him over. The despair and pain he had felt only moments before transformed into a fierce and overwhelming hope. Their baby was still fighting. The doctors wasted no time. They knew they had to act quickly. The head of the team explained to Daniel that they couldn't wait any longer, they needed to perform an emergency C-section to try and save the baby. Anna, still in critical condition, could no longer bear the strain. Everything depended on what would happen in the next few minutes. Daniel, his eyes filled with tears, nodded silently, giving his consent without hesitation. He knew it was the only chance. Within minutes, they had Anna prepped for surgery. The tension in the air was palpable, and Daniel was taken to a nearby waiting room while the doctors worked swiftly and precisely in the operating room. The wait was unbearable, each passing minute felt like an eternity. Daniel paced back and forth, unable to sit or calm his mind. The doctor's words kept echoing in his head, "The baby is still alive." Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, the doors to the operating room swung open. Daniel froze, holding his breath. A doctor emerged slowly, wearing an expression that Daniel couldn't immediately decipher. His heart pounded so hard in his chest that he thought it might burst. The doctor looked at him and, with a soft but sincere smile, said, "The baby is fine. He's a strong boy." Daniel's world came to a complete stop. The doctor's words echoed in his mind, and suddenly, all the pain, all the fear, all the anguish vanished in a single breath of relief. It's a boy. His son was alive. The miracle he had been hoping for, the miracle that had seemed impossible, had come true. Daniel, unable to hold back the tears, collapsed into a chair, his body shaking with uncontrollable sobs. It was a cry of relief, of joy, of gratitude. His son, his little warrior, had survived despite everything. Despite the abuse, the trauma, the danger, he had kept fighting, just as strong as his mother. As Daniel wept, overwhelmed by emotion, the doctor gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "The baby is in the intensive care unit," he explained calmly. "But he's doing well, and he's strong. Your wife, she's still fighting too. Things are not clear yet, but we've bought some time." The impact of those words was profound. Anna was still fighting. Though her body was on the verge of collapse, something inside her hadn't completely given up. There was a small spark of hope, and now, with their baby safe, Daniel clung to that spark. With outside, the vigil's candles continued to glow. The community was still praying for Anna, for her child, for justice. No one yet knew what had happened in that operating room, but the feeling of hope was tangible, almost palpable in the night air. They had witnessed brutality and injustice, but now, like Daniel, they were beginning to believe that after the storm, there could still be light. The sun began to rise on the horizon, tinted a pale orange, as Daniel sat in the waiting room, his heart still racing from the emotional roller coaster he had just experienced. "My son is alive." That phrase kept resonating in his mind like a mantra. Despite everything that had happened, despite the brutality Anna had endured at the hands of Smith, their son had survived. A small warrior who had already overcome what had seemed insurmountable. Daniel allowed himself a brief sigh of relief. But one battle still remained. Anna was still fighting for her life, and though she had been stabilized during the surgery, her condition remained critical. The doctors had been clear: she had suffered severe trauma, and while some progress had been made, the next few hours would be decisive. Daniel held on to hope, but fear lingered like a dark shadow in the back of his mind. As the hours passed, the news of the birth of Anna's baby spread quickly among the protesters outside the hospital. Relief and joy intertwined with the simmering anger, and the news that the baby had survived gave the community a renewed sense of purpose. The chants of "Justice for Anna" echoed louder now, and the candles at the vigil burned brighter, as if reflecting the small but significant victory in the midst of so much darkness. Inside the hospital, Daniel was taken to the neonatal intensive care unit, where he was able to see his son for the first time. The tiny, fragile boy, connected to various monitors, breathed slowly but with a strength that defied all expectations. Daniel approached the incubator cautiously, his trembling hands touching the glass as tears welled up in his eyes again. It was a miracle. His little son, so vulnerable yet so full of life, had entered the world under the most cruel of circumstances, and yet, here he was, as Daniel gazed at his son, a flash of clarity emerged in his mind. This fight wasn't just for Anna, and it wasn't just for him. It was for that little being who had come into the world amidst injustice, and for all the lives that had been cut short before they could bloom. The system that had failed Anna must not fail their son. The injustice must not continue, not while there were people willing to fight for what was right. The hours passed in the hospital, and as Daniel moved back and forth between the intensive care unit and Anna's room, the world outside continued to churn. News of the incident dominated the headlines. Videos of the abuse Anna had endured spread like wildfire across social media, and the pressure on the authorities to act decisively grew with every passing hour. Finally, under immense public pressure, the local prosecutor's office took action. They announced a formal investigation and charges against Officer Smith. The announcement was met with a mixture of relief and restrained anger from the community. While it was an important step, skepticism lingered about whether true justice would be served. Many had seen similar cases where accountability fell short, where words did not translate into real action. But this time, the community was determined not to let that happen. Daniel was contacted by the civil rights lawyers who had joined Anna's case. They explained that they were not only seeking criminal justice against Smith but were also preparing a civil lawsuit against the police department. They wanted this case to not only end in a conviction but also serve as a turning point for the entire city, an example that police brutality could no longer be tolerated. The days that followed were a mix of hope and anguish for Daniel. Anna continued to fight in the intensive care unit, and although her condition didn't worsen, doctors warned that her recovery would be slow and difficult. However, their son continued to gain strength day by day. Daniel found solace in watching him progress, knowing that, although the future remained uncertain, at least a small part of his family was safe. Finally, the day of Officer Smith's trial arrived. Outside the courthouse, hundreds of people gathered, demanding justice. Signs bearing Anna's name were raised once again, and the chants echoed with determination. This time, the community was resolved that justice would not be denied. Inside the courtroom, Daniel was accompanied by the lawyers, close friends, and members of the community who had rallied to their cause. The trial was a long and painful process. Videos of what Smith had done were played over and over, and each time the images of Anna being shoved and mistreated appeared on the screen, Daniel felt as if the pain was crushing him. But he knew that this was the only way to expose the truth, to make the world see what had really happened that day. Smith, for his part, remained cold and distant throughout the trial. While his defense tried to justify his actions, the weight of the evidence was overwhelming. The testimonies of witnesses, the videos, the doctor's statements about the physical and emotional harm Anna had suffered, all pointed to a clear display of abuse of power and excessive brutality. When the moment of sentencing arrived, Daniel could hardly breathe. The tension in the room was palpable. The judge, with a serious expression, declared Officer Smith guilty of several charges, including excessive use of force and aggravated assault. The community, who had been holding their breath, finally exhaled. Smith was sentenced to prison, and the news spread quickly. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in a mix of relief and a sense of justice served. Tears of both joy and pain flowed among the protesters. They had won, but they knew that this victory did not undo all the damage caused, nor did it bring back all the lives lost before. However, it was an important step, a sign that, this time, justice had not turned a blind eye to abuse. Inside the hospital, as the trial came to an end, Anna, for the first time since it all began, opened her eyes. It was a soft awakening, almost imperceptible at first, but for Daniel, it was like watching the sun rise after the darkest storm of his life. The doctors had warned him, her recovery would be slow, and she might not return as the same person she once was. But at that moment, as Anna looked at him with a mix of confusion and recognition, Daniel knew that the miracle he had been praying for was finally happening. Though there was still a long road ahead, seeing Anna's eyes open gave Daniel the strength to believe in a future, one where they could heal together, where justice had been served, and where their son would grow up in a world made just a little bit brighter by their fight. The baby, now stronger, was placed next to Anna in a small portable incubator. With the little strength she had left, Anna raised her trembling hand and gently stroked her son. Her eyes, filled with tears, reflected all the pain and struggle she had endured. Daniel, sitting beside her, held her hand, and in that moment, what had begun as a tragedy transformed into a symbol of resilience and hope. Justice had prevailed, but more importantly, Anna's life and her son's had triumphed. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this intense and emotional story. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and share it with your friends so that more people can learn about Anna's fight and the importance of justice. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so leave me a comment below. Your opinions are always welcome. And don't leave just yet. Be sure to watch the video now appearing on the end screen. I'm sure you'll love it. See you next time.